Hi, this is Dr. Bharadwaz. I am subject matter expert in clinical interactive response technology at ClinGenius Research. Yeah, I will start the session now. First thing you have to understand is we are now dealing with the patients who are coming into the clinical trial. So to take the patient into the clinical trial, there are certain things you need to understand. First one is inclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria means if you want to take a patient to a particular clinical trial, he should satisfy some criteria. What is that criteria is called inclusion criteria. Means the patient should have these features with him. For example, we are doing a study on diabetes, okay, and I will say you some things like the patient should be from 18 years to 60 years. Means you cannot take patients below 18 and or above 16. If I say the inclusion criteria is type 2 diabetes, means the patient should have type 2 diabetes and retinopathy means due to diabetes, eyes will be damaged, retina will be damaged for some patients. So the patient should have retinopathy. And also, if I say inclusion criteria should be having nephropathy and neuropathy, the patient should also have kidney disorders and nervous disorders to be taken into the study. That is inclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria should be satisfied means the patient should have these criteria to be taken him to the study. And next one is exclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria should be ruled out. Means if the patient have these characters with him or these phenomenon with him, he should not be taken into the clinical trial. For example, if I say cirrhosis, if the patient have liver cirrhosis, we should not be taking into the study. Or if the patient has HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, so we should not be taking him into the study. It means regularly you will be hearing that inclusion criteria should be satisfied. Means the patient should have whatever is told in the protocol for inclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria should be ruled out. Means exclusion criteria should not be there with the patient. If he has any characters mentioned in the exclusion criteria, the patient is not suitable for the clinical trial. These are the two things. And next one is who is an eligible subject and ineligible subject. The patient who is satisfying all the inclusion criteria and ruling out all the exclusion criteria is eligible subject for the clinical trial. And who is an ineligible subject? The subject who is not satisfying inclusion criteria, means what are all mentioned in inclusion criteria he has not have, and he is not ruling out exclusion criteria. Means whatever is mentioned in the exclusion criteria of the protocol, he is having those characters. That's the reason we consider him as ineligible patient. Keeping this in mind, what is inclusion criteria, what is exclusion criteria, who is eligible patient and who is ineligible patient, we now go into the transaction. The first transaction in IRT is pre-screening. What we exactly do in pre-screening? In pre-screening, what happens is we will, before we determine the subject is eligible for a clinical trial or not, that we do in screening. We have to do some procedures for the subject. For example, if he is a diabetic patient, before we determine whether the subject is eligible for clinical trial in screening, we have to do some procedures like we have to collect his blood, we have to test HbA1c or blood glucose levels, how is his liver, how is his kidney. So we have to do all these procedures. To do these procedures, the patient has to be pre-screened. So the pre-screening has to be performed in IRT and then taken all his blood and send it for the lab to perform the test. Once in the pre-screening, if we determine that the patient is not eligible for the clinical trial, then we pre-screen fail him. Okay, maybe the patient is not satisfying the criteria now. Maybe after some time, maybe 2 to 3 months, same patient comes to the clinical trial, and at that time we will pre-screen him again, so that we will check whether the patient is eligible for the clinical trial at least now. So that is pre-screening, pre-screen failure, and re-pre-screening. Once these three are done, next we take the patient to screening. In screening, we actually review the reports which we have got from the pre-screening, and we determine whether the patient is eligible for clinical trial or not. Here we will check to rule out all the exclusion criteria and to satisfy all the inclusion criteria. If the patient is not ruling out exclusion criteria and ruling unsatisfying inclusion criteria while screening, we screen fail him. Maybe at this point in time, we have to screen fail him because he is not satisfying or not ruling out some criteria. Maybe in future, after 2 to 3 months, we again perform rescreening. In rescreening, we will again check whether the patient is eligible for the clinical trial or not. This is rescreening. Once the rescreening is done, then we move the patient into run-in phase. Run-in phase means preparing the subject for a clinical trial. Run-in phase is of two types. One is we can prepare the patient by removing the substances from his body which we don't want for a clinical trial. For example, we are conducting a clinical trial on diabetes. The patient is using some other medicines for diabetes. Okay, so before we take the patient into the clinical trial, we have to remove the existing medication from his body. Basically, we are preparing the patient for the clinical trial that we do in run-in. Okay, that is washout. And also sometimes what we have to do is the patient has to be on some medication in some clinical trials for the trial, for him to continue in the trial. Maybe he is not taking the some prescribed medication for a long time, so we have to prepare the patient by giving that medication. When we give that medication, that we call as active run-in. When we remove a medication and prepare the patient for the clinical trial in a particular protocol, that we call as placebo run-in. If you give dummy drug, we call him as placebo run-in. If you give active drug in the run-in phase, it is called active run-in. There are two types of run-in. At the end of run-in, we will conduct the run-in phase for 1 week and check the criteria. And if the patient blood levels of a particular drug are not up to the desired quantity, we will run-in fail him. Okay. Once if the patient is not eligible for randomization, we will run-in fail him. Maybe at this point he is not eligible. Maybe in future he can again be eligible for run-in. So we again rerun in the patient. The same patient we rerun in. If that patient is eligible for the trial again, then we take him forward to next step. Otherwise, we will run-in fail him. Once the patient is run-in failed, then what we have to do is we have to assign the treatment to him. The treatment can be of many types, so we have to assign a particular patient to a particular treatment group. This can be done in two ways. One is randomization and one is enrollment. In randomization, so neither the patient nor the investigator, the doctor, is able to assign a particular treatment group. It is random. If there are two treatment groups in the trial, it is not in the hands of either patient or in the hands of investigator to select a particular treatment group to a subject. That this is random. This we do to eliminate the selection bias. So selection bias means, for example, if you are a doctor and there are two patients, one patient is your relative and one patient is your enemy, so you tend to choose a patient for your relative. You will try to randomize him to an active drug. For your enemy, you try to randomize him to a placebo drug. So that's the reason, to eliminate the selection bias, there we have randomization. In randomization, we will eliminate the selection bias by randomly selecting the patient. There is no choice here. It is chance. It is chance of the patient, and there is no choice for either patient or the investigator to select the particular drug. The next type of treatment assignment is enrollment. Enrollment, here the investigator has choice. In some cases, what we do is investigator will determine this patient will go into a particular treatment group, or this patient will not be going into this particular treatment group. When there is no chance, there is only choice. When the choice is given to the investigator to select a particular treatment group for the subject, it is enrollment, and there is no elimination of selection bias in enrollment. In enrollment, you cannot eliminate the selection bias. We will have scheduled visit for the patient. So scheduled visits is the visits of the patient, or we call them as transaction. Here you can take visit or transactions as a synonym. Visit and transactions are same in IRT. So in the scheduled visit, there are three types of scheduled visits. One is scheduled visit with dispensation. If the patient comes for the scheduled visit, you have to dispense the medication. Next one is scheduled visit without dispensation. The patient comes for the visit, but we will not dispense any medication. There is a third type of visit. It can be either scheduled or unscheduled visits, that investigator will decide. If investigator wants to dispense on that particular visit, he is able to dispense. If the investigator do not want to dispense on the particular visit, he have a choice not to dispense. That is three types of scheduled visits we have. Next type of visit is unscheduled visit. Unscheduled visits are done between two scheduled visits. So after randomization, there is a visit far away, and the patient has come for an emergency. In the emergency, the patient has some emergency and he came to the hospital. So that we record it as unscheduled visits. Even the same, in unscheduled visits, we have three types of visits. In unscheduled visits, as per the protocol, you can dispense the patient. If the protocol says you should not be dispensing in the unscheduled visits, you can have only unscheduled non-dispensing visit, or it can be with the discretion of the investigator. If the investigator wants to dispense, we provide the option. If he doesn't want to dispense, it is up to his choice. So there are three types of visits in unscheduled visit also. The next transaction is kit replacement. Basically, this is not a separate transaction. This is within the visit only. It can be done in a scheduled visit or unscheduled visit. Sometimes what happens is patient will lose the medication, or patient will damage the medication. Patient keeps the medication in the sun and he forgets it, so the medication is damaged. At that time, we want to replace the existing medication given to the patient. That's the reason we use kit replacement transaction. Next transaction is discontinuation. So in clinical trial, the authority is given to the subject. So if he wants to withdraw from the clinical trial at any point in time, he can withdraw. There is no need for him to give any reason for it. If the patient comes or the subject comes to the investigator and he just says, I don't want to participate in the clinical trial, we should not be asking any questions to him. We should be removing him from the clinical trial. To remove him from the clinical trial, we register him as discontinued by using discontinuation transaction. The next transaction is completion transaction. Once the patient completes all the required transaction, all the screening transaction, pre-screening transaction, randomization transaction, and also scheduled visit transaction, at the end of the clinical trial, we register him as completed once he complete all the procedures. Next transaction is follow-up. Some of the protocols demands to follow up the patient after an year. For example, we have enrolled the patient into heart trial. So we have given the medication for heart attack for maybe 1 year, 2 year, or 3 years. The treatment is done and the clinical trial is over. And some protocols say you have to follow the patient after 1 year or after 2 years and check whether how he is doing, whether he is alive or not. So this is a follow-up transaction. Basically, we will not give any medication. We will just follow up the patient either in call, or we will ask him to come to collect the information. So this is follow-up transaction. There are other transactions like unblinding. So unblinding is knowing the treatment group of the patient. Why do we want to know, our investigator want to know the treatment group of the patient? So patient suddenly developed some emergency and the treating doctor wants to know whether what is the drug given to the patient. So is there any drug reaction, whether it is the patient emergency is due to this drug. So he has to know the treatment group. Revealing the treatment group in emergency is subject, unblinding a subject. Next one is, this is direct unblinding. There is other way of unblinding. So investigator has to get the permission from the unblinding authority. So that transaction is, investigator will request, unblind subject request. He will send a request. He will perform this particular transaction and send a request to the unblinding approval or rejecting authority. That guy who is sitting in that chair will determine whether he wants to approve unblinding request sent by investigator or he has to reject. That transaction is called unblind subject approval or reject. This is done by the third party guy or any guy who has authority to give permission to investigate. If he accepts the permission or he approves the permission to unblind, investigator can unblind. If he doesn't approve, if he rejects it, investigator cannot unblind. And the next transaction is unblind kit. It is one of the important transactions. Maybe it sometimes comes under subject transactions, but it sometimes comes under study transactions or supplies transaction. It is in the both way. Normally what happens here is we consider this as subject transaction, because in emergencies, if you enter the kit number, uh, you should get the ingredients of the kit. For example, any patient has suffered some serious health issues, and the treating doctor wants to know what is in the kit that is using by the patient. If it is a blinded kit, he will not know unless he enters the kit details into unblind kit transaction, and the unblind kit transaction gives him the details of the kit, what exactly the ingredient present in the kit. So guys, these are the transactions we do generally for the patient. It is from end to end.